In 1942, a young Protestant Melbourne man, Critchley Parker, dreamed of transforming Tasmania's southwest wilderness into a new Jerusalem. But as he set off in search of his promised land, did he suspect what fate held in store?
He did what he did because he loved Caroline Isaacson. He was in awe of her, and there was no place for that love.
I think he wanted to do something rather special, perhaps improve himself.
I think he was by nature a romancist, and there was this woman who was interested in finding something.
Various things that happened make you suspect that he wasn't that interested in living beyond. He's kind of Moses-like discovery of the promised land. The others were to follow. You know, Moses never made it to Canaan, and nor was Critchley Parker ever going to be there, but they'd enabled it to the hope to survive.
You must come, Caroline, to this country and see the mountains of Port Davey as I have seen them. You will see what a magnificent centre this will be for the settlement. One of the finest harbours in Australia. A country rich in mineral wealth that the skill and efforts of the Jews will make one of the most prosperous parts of the Commonwealth.
Born into a wealthy family in 1911, Critchley was the only child of Critchley Sr. and Kathleen Parker. His father was an influential publisher renowned for a barrage of anti-German publications during World War I. An expert on mining and fisheries, he had also written extensively on Australia's mineral resources.
Critchley Parker Sr. did have quite a love of Tasmania and used to go there frequently for fishing trips, and in fact wrote a book called Tasmania, Jewel of the Commonwealth, which was celebrating the great opportunities for development on the island.
Critchley was plagued with poor health as a child, suffering from tuberculosis and pleurisy. At the outbreak of World War II, he was declared unfit for military service. But despite his physical condition, he considered himself an adventurer and had been on several hiking trips abroad.
I've never known Critchley actually to have a career, a profession. I imagine that he possibly had a private income because he certainly had a little bit of money.
Mining must be the first action of the new settlement, owing to the presence of considerable deposits of gold, tin, iron, copper and probably coal and oil too. These sources can be used to finance the other activities of the settlement. As the Jews have done so well in Palestine on the land, I feel sure they will make equally good miners.
In 1938, Critchley met Caroline Isaacson, a journalist who at the time was the women's page editor of Melbourne's Age newspaper.
He was very taken with my mother, who was a sophisticated, quite beautiful woman. I think my mother was interested, possibly took him under her wing a bit. I mean, he really loved, I think, everything about her and admired her mind. And I mean, she was very attractive, even though she was 10 years older than he. But I think he needed someone older. I don't think a young woman would have understood him so well.
The community, as its wealth increases, should buy any European art treasures that should come on the market, as well as entire buildings and castles that can be reconstructed in identical surroundings in Tasmania. There seems no reason why Port Davey should not become the Paris of Australasia, both as a centre of fashion and a centre for articles de luxe.
Caroline was an active member of Melbourne's Jewish community. She was chairperson of the Women's International Zionist Organisation and would go on to become the head of the Jewish Board of Deputies.
She was not a religious person, but she was culturally Jewish. She was interested in the Jewish religion from a cultural point of view.
She always had a feeling for Judaism, and particularly for those who were less fortunate. She tried to make sure that the doors of Australia were open to refugees from Europe who were escaping from Nazism.
In the mid-1930s, the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine was being hampered by Arab-Jewish conflict. With the rise of Nazism in Germany, some sections of the Zionist movement began to look for alternative locations for a settlement. By the late 30s, the British-based Freeland League for Jewish Territorial Colonisation was considering the Kimberley region of northwest Australia as a preferred site for a homeland. The League's secretary, Dr. Isaac Steinberg, came to Australia with a plan to settle up to 75,000 refugees here. He quickly gained the support of many community leaders, and his plan was approved by the Western Australian government. Gaining the support of the federal government, however, would prove to be a far greater hurdle.
There was a policy at that stage against block settlement. You know, if Australia was going to accept migrants, they had to assimilate into the community. They weren't there to create what was seen as potential ghettos. And so, but the principle of this Freeland League was to create a block settlement.
At the outbreak of World War II, Steinberg embarked on a tour of Australia to gain national public support for his scheme. While visiting Melbourne in 1940, he met Caroline and Critchley.
They used to have great discussions about the Kimberleys, settling people on the Kimberleys and how they'd go about it, and they would have interviews with politicians and so forth, who were quite keen on the idea at the time. And then Critchley, who was very interested in Tasmania and loved Tasmania, he suggested the idea of settling refugees in Tasmania. And then my mother got very enthusiastic about that and thought, well, perhaps they might be better off in Tasmania than in the heat and dust of the Kimberleys.
Critchley had this entree into the Tasmanian government, and so thought, well, I'll use this, and did so. So he felt that he was doing something that my mother was interested in, and so he became interested in it.
Because it hadn't been an actual goal in his life before. And looking back on it, I think this was, and I think he was inspired by my mother's enthusiasm and strength. Oh, she said to me once, what would you do if I married Critchley? And I just said, I'd leave. I'd just go. Which is a typically sort of remark, I suppose, of a 16-year-old at that time. I just wasn't interested in Critchley being, you know, part of the... My father was still there, of course. But I don't know whether he knew.
Critchley set about convincing Steinberg of Tasmania's willingness and suitability for a Jewish settlement. He used his father's influence to arrange a state-sponsored trip. In the summer of 1941, Critchley, Caroline and Dr. Steinberg travelled to Tasmania to survey possible sites for settlement.
Steinberg was quite sceptical of this, but it was part of his business to try and seek support for the idea of a homeland. So the very fact that this island state wanted such a colony was something that he felt he needed to respect.
At the end of their trip, the Tasmanian Premier, Robert Cosgrove, gave approval in principle for the establishment of a Jewish settlement. Armed with this assurance, Steinberg returned to the mainland to approach the federal government. As the war threatened to encroach on Australian soil, however, any consideration of Jewish colonisation was again put on hold. Frustrated by a lack of progress for his vision, Critchley decided to take matters into his own hands. He planned to return alone to Tasmania to continue the search for a site for his new Jerusalem.
People said, oh, no, it's too dangerous for you to go on your own. And I think Critchley wanted to prove that he could do this.
Critchley set off in the autumn of 1942 to explore the Port Davey region in Tasmania's southwest. He made his way to Melaleuca, a remote mining camp whose only inhabitant was Charlie King.
Grandfather had to row Critchley Parker to the start of the track, the Port Davey track. So Grandfather rowed him all this way, dropped him and his provisions off at the foot of Mount Mackenzie. I think my grandfather was perhaps a little bit anxious about him because he could see that his bush skills weren't really too good.
I was sorry to leave Charlie King, an honest old man with whom I had a pleasant stay. Judging him one to be trusted, I mentioned the purpose of my visit. He was most enthusiastic, and though suffering from a bad rupture and a worse cough, insisted on making his contribution by taking me over here.
I don't know what my grandfather would have thought. I suppose development and progress was what you were meant to do, but I don't think he would have liked to have seen his Port Davey, his own homeland, being turned into a town.
I think you will agree that this is the natural centre for the settlement. As a tribute to the Australian Aboriginal, the name might well be Poinduk, the original name. The city should be planned so as to be a model for the whole world. None, I feel, can do this better than the architect Le Corbusier. He will give the outward aspect of the settlement the spiritual meaning of the whole project. The real wealth of the community will be in its people, and I desire that their whole life will so amaze the people of Australia that the little settlement of Poinduk will be the leaven which will completely change the economic and financial system of Australia.
By all accounts, the first couple of days were quite idyllic. The weather was quite benign, but clouds started to form, and eventually things became very difficult. The weather was just too bleak to continue on, and so Critchley determined that the best thing for him would be to return to base.
Dear Caroline, 12 days ago I left with Mr. King in a small boat to reach this spot, the starting point of Marsden's track, which leads to Fitzgerald, 60 miles to the northeast. Should anything occur making it impossible to complete the journey, I was to return here and make 2 smoke columns by firing the grass on Mount Mackenzie. The weather broke 2 days after I left, and the last 10 days have seen rain, hail and violent gales with, I fear, every possibility of their continuing for weeks. As I had not gone very far up the track, I immediately returned here, certain that the signal would bring Mr. King over. 3 times on different days I have made the signal when the weather has allowed it to be seen, but as there has been no response, he cannot have seen them. To make matters worse, I had been careless with my matches. Some became damp, and not realising this, I wasted half a box in trying to make a fire. Another half box were burnt on the slopes of Mount Mackenzie. I knew so well the importance of the smoke signals that, thinking nothing save the one in reply, I forgot about the matches left by a tussock, and they were burnt.
When the search started, Arthur Fleming was the police officer in charge of search and rescue, and they recalled my father, Denny King, from the Second World War to come back, and because his bush skills were so good and he knew the area so well.
My food supply ran out 2 days ago, and I now exist on aspirin and water. The striking surface of my last box of matches is now worn out, so I can no longer light a fire. But I have a very comfortable camp, which I took precaution of surrounding with a brushwood barricade, and as the rucksack has plenty of warm clothing, I do not feel there will be anything more than a gradual loss of the senses and a final sink into unconsciousness.
They started off from where my grandfather had let him off at Mount Mackenzie. They could see his footprints. Even after all that time, they could see some footprints, but then they lost them and thought perhaps he'd climbed up into the Western Arthur Ranges, up Mount Hayes or something. And they had a party searching from the Huon end of the track as well, and from up that end, but they didn't find anything.
If only he had waited till the summer, if only he had picked a different part of Tasmania, if only he had let people know where he was going, you know, all these ifs.
Mount Mackenzie, my permanent address. Dear Caroline, I have so much to say, as this is the last letter I shall write to you. I should like my body to lie at the southern entrance to Port Davey, close to the edge of the yellow cliff that stands there, so that I shall see all the vessels that go in and out of the harbour from our settlement. When you join me there, a column could be erected so that all will see it. If this joint existence cannot be in the flesh, let it be in the spirit, and I would ask you to live on, to reach that perfection which we had dreamed of for us both. To die in the service of so noble a cause is to me a great satisfaction, and if, as I hope, the settlement brings happiness to many refugees, and in doing so serves the state of Tasmania, I die happy.
My uncle recalled finding him. It must have been quite a shock for them, for these fishermen, to find this body. The tent had blown away, and there he was, poking out of his sleeping bag in quite a decomposed state.
I never remember her saying anything, you know, be breaking down or talking about it. Maybe it was too painful to talk about.
I think she was deeply upset about it. I'm sure she was. And that was the reason she joined the army. I think she just wanted to get away from her previous life and be doing something that was quite different.
It has been said that he didn't want to live. Well, why wouldn't he want to live? Because he'd found someone that he was very fond of, and she was fond of him. He had found an interest and something he, so to speak, he could get his teeth into, perhaps for the first time in his adulthood. And there was no reason that he didn't want to live, and I think that was very, very sad.
Dying for being a martyr for the Jews, I think for Critchley was also a way of testifying his love for Caroline too, finding a place for it both in the world and in Australia.
My uncle and his stepfather went past a few times that autumn in their fishing boats. Uncle Clyde said, why didn't he pitch his tent where it could be seen from the water? A little white tent, it's fairly open country. Why didn't he pitch it where he could be seen if he wanted to be found?
I think it was preferred not to think of it as a suicide, particularly given the sensibilities of his parents at that time, and you know that would have been a great cause of great shame there. Even though it was a martyrdom, it was still seen as a shameful suicide. So it was never really recorded as such.
I don't believe that he committed intentional suicide. Why wouldn't he want to be found? I mean, he had everything to live for. Whether my mother and he had ideas of staying together, getting together, staying together, I don't know. I don't know.